Welcome, everyone. We're going to start in just 1 minute exactly. Does it show on your screens that the recording is happening?
Yes.
Great.
For the first time, I realized that it gives you the option of canceling if you don't want to be recorded.
Oh, really? As a presenter, Sally, probably.
Well, it says continue, cancel.
That's for you, but
other presenter. Oh, okay, I got it. Okay, got it. Okay, all right.
That's all right. All right, let's begin. Good afternoon for all of us now. Welcome to the Alternatives Workshop, the history of the consumer survivor movement with Sally Zinman and Gail Bluebird. I will be your Zoom host for this workshop. Please note that we are recording this workshop. If you would rather be incognito, either turn off your camera, change your name, whatever makes you feel comfortable. If you would like to see the closed captioning during this workshop, click on the CC Live Transcript button at the bottom of your screen and click on Live Transcript, Enable Auto Transcription. We ask participants to keep themselves on mute. If you have questions or comments for presenters, please use the chat box or raise your hand. We will read your questions and may have time for questions live later in the presentation. Gail Bluebird is a retired RN, has been active in the consumer survivor movement since the early 1970s. She has served in many roles as a peer supporter and director of programs. She is best known as an arts networker, finding ways for artists to tell their stories through art. With funds from SAMHSA, she wrote a manual on the arts, Reaching Across the Arts, still relevant today. I could say much more about Bluebird, but that's all I'm going to say for now. She can tell you more too. Sally Zinman has been a pioneer of the mental health peer movement since the mid-1970s. Sally's commitment to the rights of people with mental health challenges came from her own horrendous experience in the mental health system. After this experience, she connected with the burgeoning ex-patient mental movement and found a community of people like herself, a family who inspired and supported her for the next 40 years. Sally founded some of the earliest consumer-run drop-in centers in the country. Currently, she is the executive director of the California Association of Mental Health Peer-Run Organizations, CAMPRO, a statewide organization that provides advocacy, outreach, and training services to California's consumer community. Sally.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Someday we will all meet in person. I'm going to concentrate on the early history of the consumer survivor, ex-patient, psychiatric inmate movement, which is, we used to call ourselves psychiatric inmates because we all felt that we had been inmates in a prison-like settings and treated that way. Because this is the part that most of you don't know. You know, this goes back to a kind of organizing and radical militancy that many of us are not as familiar with now in our movement. Next slide. And I also want to say it's really a story as I've looked at this PowerPoint over the years of advocacy. Not just our movement's advocacy, but the power of advocacy, and that advocacy really does make a difference. It does change things, and it starts with a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens. This is a quote from Margaret Mead: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." Next slide. And this is a small group of thoughtful citizens changing the world. I don't know when this is. It's probably 1975, 76. You can see it's a demonstration against shock treatment. And that most of our activity at that time was demonstrations and protests. And as I said, sort of radical militant action. So next slide. Because this is a wonderful picture. Actually, Gail Bluebird is in there. I don't know if you can see yourself, Gail, or sort of to the side on the right. Leonard Frank is in there, Wade Hudson, some of the great pioneers of our movement, in front of the Governor Brown's office the first time he was governor. So I think it's in 1976. Can't see the date. And people done a sleep out in his outer lobby, which today you could not get into. You couldn't even get into the outer lobby. But the point is from the early days of standing outside the halls of power with placards to sitting at the decision-making table today, the consumer advocacy movement has been responsible for major changes in almost 50 years of organizing. Advocacy really does make a difference and affects change. And what I'm going to talk about is the advocacy of pretty much the 1970s. Next slide. I want to give you the background and then what it looked like. Background and then what it looked like. I can't trace these concepts throughout the years, but I want you to think about them. That was a mistake, sorry. Thought of everything, but I forgot the phone. Okay. There were the world was totally different then. The environment was totally different. The strands I want you to think of were, at that time, everything was about us without us. You know, we have nothing about us without us, so everything was. We were not in any room, we were not in any building, we were not in the grounds, we weren't anywhere. So of course, when that occurs, what you do is you raise hell, you make noise, and you're militant. So people hear you and you get in the doors. Secondly, there was no recovery model. Although we knew when we met with each other, we recovered because we had, so we knew about each other. But the culture of the mental health behavioral health system was once you were diagnosed with a mental illness, you were mentally ill for the rest of your life. There would be a downward trajectory. You'd be on drugs and more drugs the rest of your life. And maybe the best you could dream of or aspire to was being in a board and care home and being some kind of custodial care. There were no rights. There were great big state hospitals. There was no controls on seclusion and restraint or the moldy medications. One of our great leaders had 40 insulin shock and 40 shock treatments. There were no rights even in terms of signing deeds or getting married. And also none of us worked. The concept of being peers, or peers being a profession, or even peers being acknowledged as a significant value in services in and outside of the mental health system, just didn't exist. And most of us didn't work anyway. And if we did, it was not in our advocacy field. So I'm not going to be able to trace those trends throughout the years because I'm concentrating on the early years, but I would like you to think about how things have changed in the culture of the mental health system. And it's because of this small group of committed, thoughtful people. It's because of advocacy that does make a difference. So in the 1960s, the environment was such that there was this rampant civil rights movement, African-American, women, gays, and people with physical disabilities organizing. This is what we emerged into as we left hospitals. For decades, we had been denied basic civil liberties and really suffered inhumane treatment and spent lifetimes really locked up in hospitals and dying in hospitals and going into unmarked graves. At the same time, the hospitals began to shut down. They were beginning to shut down, and new laws limiting involuntary treatment were emerging. So you've got it more difficult to commit people. People leaving hospitals because they're being shut down, coming into an environment of a rampant civil rights movement environment. It's like a perfect storm to usher in our consumer, survivor, ex-patient, psychiatric inmate movement. Next slide. As I said, we began meeting, and this is sort of anecdotal, but I've heard it from so many people. We began meeting separately until outside the hospital without nurses, started talking to each other, started sharing our anger, validating each other's feelings, talking about the need of independent living, and validating the feeling, what medication did to you. You know, that it wasn't you, it was the medication. And out of all this, a new civil rights movement was formed, which is our movement, which is, in my opinion, a little still too closeted, but our survivor movement. I have always thought it was a liberation movement, and I still do. Next slide. So that's sort of the background, and here is the activities and principles. This was our newspaper, you know, which was put out quarterly by Collective, and maybe not quarterly if the Collective didn't get it together. This is from 1978, and you can see the doctor with the needle and to hell with their profits, stop forced treatment. This was the mood and temper and militancy of the time. Dangerous psychiatrists released. Next slide. In the beginning of the 1970s, was really a time of finding each other, of realizing we were not alone. I remember my pivotal moment, the first International Conference on Human Rights and Against Psychiatric Oppression that I went to, and I realized I was not alone. You know, I sort of married a whole new family, which I've been connected to all these years. It was in very militant groups and actions, a lot of self and group education, because nobody told us about the drugs. Nobody told us about shock treatment. So we had to write our own pamphlets in our own language to educate ourselves. And also was sort of defining our core values of what we really stood for. And it was very separatist, which then the pros and cons about being a separatist. In the beginning, probably really disempowered, marginal people have to come together of just themselves to empower themselves so they can go out into the world and have a voice. So I think there's a time and place for separatist groups. But there's also a time to stop them and reach out to the thousands and thousands of consumers that were not reached at that time. Next slide. There were groups around, now I'm talking about more what it looked like. There are autonomous groups around the whole country, but you know, we believe totally in local control. So they're very autonomous from each other. There's a huge thing, we would not take money from the mental health system. The mental health system was our enemy. People that were involved with the mental health system or were by association our enemy. We were very separatist, and there was no major outreach. We sort of talked to each other nationally, talked to each other, came to conferences, piggybacked on the federal government's and other people's conferences, but mostly talked to each other. But we were empowering ourselves and beginning to value ourselves and get strong enough to enter that outside world and make a difference. Next slide. The principles and values I've talked about, developing core values. We're totally 100% against forced treatment. against inhumane treatments, medications, ECT, lobotomy, which, by the way, when I got involved in 1977 was beginning to come back, being called psychosurgery, seclusion and restraints. Instead of using stigma and discrimination, we use words of sadism and mentalism in the isms of the time, of feminism and racism. Very anti-medical model verging on anti-psychiatry, probably more anti-psychiatry. Also is the emergence of mental patient-run alternatives to the mental health system and peer support. Those things didn't exist. They were really, they emerged out of the minds of people gathering in campgrounds and college campuses and developing how they wanted to see the mental health system work. I mean, what you're used to now did not exist then. Can you go back one? And obviously, a big principle emerging over all of this is the involvement in every aspect of the mental health system. Everything was about us without us, and we all believe that to this day. We are the people most directly affected and should be in the center of the decision making, not just input, be the decision makers. I believe in these concepts today. Over 40, 50 years, I say them differently. I don't talk about being against forced treatment. I talk about being for self-determination and choice. You know, I sort of frame it anti-medical model. I talk about holistic services and meeting people where they were at and dealing with their real life problems and the injustices of the world. So it's the same concepts, the same values, just sort of described in a different way, at least for me. Next slide. So what did it look like? As I said, really political militant activism, demonstrations, and some in-your-face demonstrations where people got locked up, you know, where there was civil disobedience. I think in one demonstration, 2 people went and turned off the electricity in a hospital. There was an annual conference on human rights and against psychiatric oppression, and it was held at campgrounds, college campuses. It was unfunded. People hitchhiked to get there, took buses, however they could get there. It lasted until 1985. I want to talk, there's Mandis Network News, which you saw a picture of, which is our news vehicle for communication. And as I said, small groups mostly it was on the 2 coasts, but not entirely. It was wherever somebody was very active. There was in Kansas, it's in Florida because I was active there. So it was also places where people, not just Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and California, but in places where there were just very active people. You know, how a real clear expression of the difference between now and then was the names of the groups. There was a Network Against Psychiatric Assault, Insane Liberation Front, Mental Patient Liberation Front, and what is the group? The California Association of Mental Health Peer-run Organizations is our statewide organization. The names have changed. Alameda County Network of Mental Health Clients. Our names express the difference in our approach to organizing now. As I said, our most common self-description was psychiatric inmate because we felt we had been inmates in psychiatric jails. We also had lots of support and consciousness raising groups, which is what we called, probably what you would call peer support groups now. But we used, again, we were in the times of emancipation and liberation in the country. And these were the words and the concepts that people were using. Next slide. A really landmark book And I hope all of you have in your library or have read it. It was On Our Own, Patient-Controlled Alternatives to the Mental Health System by Judy Chamberlain. And it, for some reason, opened up the government's eyes to the consumer movement and the importance of the consumer voice and consumer experience. Sometimes something just goes viral, and this went viral. So next slide. When we talked about that, everything was about us without us. So what you do when that happens is you're not in any hall, you're not in any room, you're not in any table. Just even think about consumers even having input into the mental health system would have been considered ludicrous at that time. So what you do is you demonstrate, you're loud, you're boisterous, you're in people's faces. This is an example, actually it's from 1980, in which we had our international conference against for human rights and against psychiatric oppression in Berkeley. And we barred the doors of the American Psychiatric Association was meeting that year in San Francisco. So we linked arms and barred the doors to the entrance. And there was an anarchist among us who changed the banner, the marquee, to the conference hall that had said, "Welcome American Psychiatric Association." And you see what she did. She said, "Welcome a psychiatric ass CIA." That's where we were. That was the way we organized. That's the way we sought to change the mental health system, because it was the only vehicle available to us. Next slide. I've had to run through this because it's go back. It's a short amount of time, but there were huge transitions in the 1980s. This is the great Howie the Heart, who was very, very active in the 70s and active in these demonstrations, but also active as we moved into the 80s. And next slide. You start moving into a transitional time. We made major decisions that left many of the more purist activists behind. For instance, one of them was taking money from the mental health system. And these were not easy decisions. There were great fights and arguments about it. We began the process of re-entering the world that so hurt us, but we had empowered ourselves over a decade. And many of the founding endeavors ended and new ventures started. It's the methods of organizing in the 70s or in the very early days were replaced by other ways of organizing because we started getting what we wanted. So things like Madness Network News stopped publishing in 1986. The Conference on Human Rights and Against Psychiatric Oppression, the last conference was in 1985, and the first alternatives conference funded by the federal government at the time was in 1985. So you can see the shift from that radical in-your-face militancy, you're my enemy, to a different way of organizing, but it's always to make change, always to advocate, and for me, always to implement and make realistic those principles that I outlined earlier. And there were indications that many of our goals were beginning to be realized. Like we had talked a lot before, conceptualized, but now they began to be implemented. In the 1980s, the first drop-in centers appeared. Statewide organizations appeared. We began to sit on advisory boards, etc. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Gail Bluebird, who is going to trace the arts through some of these eras. And I'm sorry, this is very, very quick. The time is short. It's an exciting, wonderful era in which all of us stand on the shoulders of those people. Thank you.
Bluebird, can you unmute yourself? You can do it.
She's trying.
She did it before. She'll do it again.
Yeah.
Sally, do you want to talk a little more? Should we have a question while we're?
Yeah. Let me unmute myself. Let me look at the chat. If there's anything in the chat.
Oh, Bluebird's here. Yay. Welcome.
I'm sorry. I think that I must have a button or a little thing that does not work. So, but anyway, here I am. And the title of my presentation is Arts, Illustrating and Making History. And before we get into that, I would really like to thank Judy for helping Sally and I with our presentation. I definitely would like to say thank you to Sally, who I've known many years, and we've worked together on different projects, and pretty much we had similar feelings about things. So that was really nice. Deb Trueheart helped me to develop an art exhibit that was available to the conference, and I hope you've seen it. So anyway, thank you again, and I understand that I didn't see all of the conference, but I understand that it's been a really positive experience. The person who did this artwork, whose name is Nicoma Frederick, and he works with the Creative Vision Factory in Wilmington, Delaware. Nicoma is amazing. He's written a number of books. He's been recognized, and he's shown his work in many different galleries. So he's probably one of the most illustrious persons, or one of the most illustrious artists that go to the Creative Vision Factory, which was a program that I helped to make or develop when I was living and working in Delaware. I guess the other thing I want to say is the approach that I am making with the arts is not just about arts being a nice thing, or not arts work being healing, all the different things that we know that arts are. But I really think I've been working on forever, for many years, in developing a home, a national home for the arts, to do a number of different things that under that national umbrella, I guess is what I want to say. So, and I don't know if I'll have any slides on this, but we had organized years ago an organization called Altered States of the Arts. And we had a journal that went around called The Altered State. It went to different states and different communities who then did their own version. So it was a really, really good thing. But the person that did the website for us died, and we just were not able to recover the organization. So if you look at this slide, you're looking at some of the things that Nicoma felt were important to him. I don't know if he felt important about the injection, but at any rate, it's there. Okay, so if you want to go to the next slide. So in the beginning, I don't think anybody thought about the arts having a special place, but it was used in the early days to reflect anger, outrage, protest, and political ideology. And I think one of the interesting protests was the one that Sally talked about at the psychiatric convention, and rearranging the word to say something else. So that would have been one of the ways in which art was used. There were posters that were made for demonstrations and protests, newsletters, and we're going to talk about that. There's chants, many that were taken from the civil rights movement. One of them being, "What do we want? And then the word was freedom. And when do we want it? And the answer was now. Also, we had songs, music, and poetry. So do you want to go next? Here's an example of signs that were made. There was always a kind of a gathering of our making signs. Some people, really did artistic ones. The one here with the words are, "We'd rather be mad with the truth than sane with lies." I like that phrase a lot. And here's somebody that decorated his poster. Isn't life shocking? So some of them were really clever and artistic. Okay, next. This was one of the issues of Madness Network News, which had the byline of "all the fits that's news to print," which I always liked. Tanya Tempkin was this is such an amazing drawing picture of women. This was we sometimes had special issues on different topics, and this was the special women's issue. And you could really spend a lot of time looking at this. Mostly you're seeing women's arms, and they're raised, and their fists are clenched, and they're angry and they're determined. And then there's other women who are quiet and probably sad, but the way out with this little door down here was not available to anybody. In other words, they couldn't get out. But I really like that. Tanya Tempkin has been working, or I'm not sure about now, for a medical research company, I believe. And so I don't think she stayed with our movement so much, but we always go back and look at her art. Okay, next. Well, I saw this sleep in, not just a sit in, but a sleep in, as also an artistic expression, because not only did we have pictures taken of all of us, there were sleeping bags on either side of a big room, and we were given permission to sleep in with Governor Jerry Brown, who was the governor at that time. Wade Hudson and Leonard Frank met probably daily or whenever they could with the governor to talk about deaths that were occurring in state hospitals, and also using patients as labor, as free labor, and of course not getting paid. But there were also other issues, which is seclusion and restraint, holding people down, just an ECT, of course. And I think they made some differences. As far as I can remember, I believe there was a investigation in terms of people that were dying. These were also people that had been in institutions and witnessed others that were treated badly and sometimes died. Okay, next. Genie Vitulis was a songwriter, singer, guitarist. She wrote several protest songs, I think, so we always had her music with us. And she wrote a song for Howie that was called "How We Loved Howie." She went on, I'm not sure if she was in school at that particular time, but she went on to be an attorney. And I think she worked somewhere in South California. So she didn't stay with the movement, but in a way she has made a tremendous contribution. Okay, next. Howie was liked and loved by everybody who knew him, and you could probably, give an award for his advocacy efforts. But in our arts world, Howie was very, very involved in the arts, and he had a harmonica that was given to him when he had been hospitalized or institutionalized as a teenager, that a psych tech gave him a harmonica. So he always had his harmonica with him. And I used to think that he used it to mediate. There were always, conflicts going on, but he was a mediator, among other things. He was our P, or the most loved MC at our talent shows. But he also had his own kind of language. So he liked to call us crazy folk. And what he said was, crazy folk are the most talented people in the galaxy. Instead of diagnosing, locking up, and treating us, the world should recognize our true worth and support our talents, creativity, and sensitivity. Okay. Let's see, what else did I want to say about Howie? He both worked in California and New York. I think he most felt at home in New York. So there's a Howie the Heart training for peer specialists in his name. And for a long time in California, he ran a drop-in center that was a full service drop-in center for people that really had nowhere to go. He died a young death in 1995. And one thing, he did not take care of himself really well physically. Okay. Cookie Gann, her name was mentioned. I believe there was an award given in her name. She called herself an artiste extraordinaire. She was quite a, oh wow, we're having a thunderstorm. She was quite a character, an activist. She was a poet, a performance artist, and she, in this showing, she's able to stand, but later she was in a wheelchair, and she had all of her kind of things that she was selling, almost like a little traveling salesman. And so she also was very outspoken about being a lesbian. I believe she was one of the first people to do that at Alternatives. So she kind of represented a lot of things. She was a person with a disability, a shock survivor, African-American lesbian, and seller of buttons and other wares. Her buttons were amazing. Okay, next. The arts really have come a long way. So I think most people just think that the arts are wonderful, and people like doing art, and people remember being in the hospital and there was an art therapy group. One of the things that I noticed at an early conference is we had started to have talent shows. And I believe it might have been in South Carolina, that somebody got up for the talent show and did her kind of being drunk act, showing what that felt like to her, what it meant to her. And she illustrated her story, her kind of being an alcoholic in her story. And when I saw that, I thought, that is really what we're all about, is that as we organize the arts and we do more with them, always we need to be telling our stories. We need to be thinking that art is a political, sociological tool to be used. So now there's been quite a lot of movement with the art. And we could also say, I call it our arts movement myself. But there's peer-run art centers in different parts of the country. One of the oldest organizations is in Connecticut with a, let's see, I can't even remember their name. This is why I have trouble, because I can't remember things, but I'll probably come back to it. Yeah, I can't think. But anyway, they're a troupe that goes around the Northeast and does skits, and all of their skits are about their experiences as persons with a disability. We had an organization years ago called Altered States of the Arts. I would really like to see that there would be another movement towards creating an arts organization. I guess you could say that I still have a goal, I guess you could say, to help start that. And one of the things we did at this conference, mostly Deb and I, and also, oh God, I can't think of her name. We had a third person who helped to develop a really nice and message carrying art exhibit, which I think is available on the website. So I saw that as, you know, when I created this, I had artists from different parts of the country that took part in it and showed their art and also their bios. So again, artists with a message is what I'm really thinking and talking about. There's also in New York, actually I don't think he's a peer, but he's a professor who is trying to organize a special name or a special, I can't do this anymore. It's for a peer arts mentor. So we have kind of a idea of what that would be, is that peers would be hired at a local organization and would go out to either hospital settings or nursing homes or homeless shelters and centers. So there's a little bit of a movement towards that, and I'm part of that. All right, let me see if I have anything else. I'm not sure. Well, there's me. Probably one of the things I most enjoyed was dressing up like Henrietta, having a little skit that had her own message, and you know, quite a number of times I did that little skit. So there's a lot of happy memories from that. So I still call myself a traveling crazy folks artist, and I thank you. Thank you so much.
I know we're getting close to the end of the time, but I think we should go ahead and if Sally and Bluebird say more, and if people want to ask questions, raise your hand, or physically or at the reactions at the bottom. I think we can go a little over. We've got you here. I'd like to hear you talk more. Shanti wants to say something.
Oh, you're wanting us to go back to our PowerPoint, you mean?
No. Just people get to ask questions.
No, you don't want that.
Shanti raised their hand.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. It's just been so interesting. And my dear friend Bluebird, I'm so glad to be here today and that we're able to join it live in person here. So I had put a question in the chat because currently, you know, my hospitalization after my trauma events was in 1978. So it's very interesting to be hearing about what was going on then, because I had no awareness of it at that time. But now in 2021, I have two friends who, because I do grief, I'm a grief specialist, grief recovery. So I've had two clients who are my peers, obviously, but who have one of them walked into an emergency room because he was so deep in grief after his wife died, he didn't know what to do. He just felt like he was jumping out of his skin, and he walked into an ER and he was hospitalized for 4 days against his will. And that's this year, and medicated with different things and told, you know, just take this. And so, but they made him stay for days and he just wanted to go home. He has a beautiful place out in the country, and another woman as well. So, you know, I'm fortunate to have clients who are mental health practitioners and also peers. And I'm really enjoying the grief work. And the question is this, though: I want to hear their stories, talk about their stories, and expose these stories here locally about what's currently going on in the mistreatment of people. And I wonder if, because the times have changed and we have a certain wisdom and a certain cooperativeness among, you know, all people in the community. So we're not in that radical, hard hard phase we were in 30 years ago. So I just wondered if there are any suggestions. I mean, I can write letters, I can call the hospital and ask to talk to people. I just don't know where to begin because I just want to get their stories out and make sure people understand that this is currently going on. And I think for them, it was their first experience in the mental health system, and they vowed that it would be their last.
Well, this is Sally. I mean, often that happens when your first experience is forced treatment, and it doesn't, they can capture you for a month or 2 months or 6 months, but they will never see you again because your experience with forced treatment. There has been a drift away from not only that militancy, but a huge drift away from that, but also our core values and principles. It's why I always want to do this workshop about advocacy and our core values. There's many parts of the country and even in California where that advocacy is picking up as a it's not new, but an old new way of organizing. And I think that's what has to happen. We are now cooperating with what we used to call the enemy. And that creates a lot of compromises. In my life, I have felt that the gains outweighed the compromises and losses, but sometimes it's a iffy thing. So I think that you should do the advocacy. Just do it. We all have to do it again. Actually, we're backsliding hugely in this country towards reopening hospitals, getting more beds, more forced treatment, more outpatient commitment. We really have to go back to that advocacy.
One of the things I'd like to say is that peers are not, peers that are going to alternatives, and I was there 2 years ago, looked and acted very different. They're not complaining as much about their services. In many cases, even, psychiatrists, nurses have gotten the word that, recovery is real. One of the things, though, that is happening in both good and bad is that peer specialists have been hired and trained. There's training for them to be certified. And when they go to work in whatever setting it is, whether it's in the community or in the hospital, they often are not given the opportunity to be a peer specialist. Instead, they get caught up in the system and they don't know quite what their boundaries are. So I was part of looking at that. And I think a lot of peer specialists are, trying to put light on that. But one of the other things that's happening, I think that's very positive, is the peer crisis respite centers are being organized many different places. And I think those are working pretty well. They get their funding from the states a lot of times. And that's another thing. The state, depending on which state it is, there's a fair amount of money that goes to the development of peer-run programs. Georgia, for example, is probably the largest organized organization throughout the whole state where peers are common and probably treated pretty good. So there's things ahead. One of the things I just want to say is that I had started to fantasize that we would have like a home health, only this would be an arts mentor that would, go out like home health nurses do and do arts workshops and arts activities with people in different settings where they're not necessarily given very many things to do. So those are just the things I know. But I think we're still fighting. And I just had a horrible family time with what we do with somebody that was gone for 6 days and hadn't eaten and hadn't drunk. And what was interesting is that the police did not take him to a hospital facility. They had our family was able to pick him up. And I think he's going voluntary for treatment. So that's a good story. But I think when you're going through that in a family way, or it's really directly involving you, it's hard to hold on to your politics. That's all I want to say.
Joseph Rogers raised his hand.
Hi, Sally. Wonderful, Sally and Bluebird. You're good to hear the history. I hope we keep it going. And I just wanted to, in terms of the history, I haven't heard much about the history, but Jay Mueller and the California Network was one of the, and Jay Mueller's countywide group, I'm blanking on the name, were one of the early models for me that looked at cooperation, but looked at continuing to do some pretty hard advocacy. Could you talk a little bit about what Jay Mueller did?
Well, I did a little memorial video about him, and I agree with you. I always admired Jay right in the beginning, in the 70s, when his peers defined the mental health system as the enemy. Jay was working within, he was sort of an inside advocate and always believed cooperating and working with the people in power to get things done. I mean, that was very, very unique about him. And he got huge things done. I mean, he, in California, through doing that, got what they call a year of the consumer from this prestigious advisory group in conferences and trainings. And out of that emerged the California Network of Mental Health Clients. That was because he worked from the inside. And we all cannot, we have to always acknowledge the importance of inside and outside advocacy. And Jay was monumental in modeling what inside advocacy was without losing his principles. And he was a visionary. I mean, he was doing peer support in his own county before it was popular. In fact, they got a federal grant that the county turned down because they were not ready to have peer providers in that county. He was doing spirituality in the mental health system. He was a recovery model. He sort of tried to bring to his county in California. He was one of the great pioneers in our movement. And I'm so glad to see so many of you that I haven't seen in so long, even if it is virtual.
And Casper, raise your hand.
Hello, thank you so much. I'm following Howard the Harp's footsteps because I'm literally in New York City from Oregon today. And tomorrow we'll be meeting with a bunch of peers at what's called a PIP, peers in person, after all this stuff. I just want to say thank you so much, Gail. And thank you so much, Sally, for all your work all these years. And my question is for new people coming in to this, what messages, what advice do you have? Maybe they have heard nothing of this history that you're saying today, things like that. They just heard about this movement. And then, sorry, two questions then too. How can we see that special women's issue from 1977? And are these archives online? So those two questions. Thank you again so much.
Well, I would say to new people, I mean, I always start out with values and principles. I mean, that's what you have to go back to, is the values of our movement, however they're stated, and things flow from them. It is, I have to say it's true that because of those pioneers and the people that followed them, many people who go into the mental health system do not experience the things that I did or other people did in the 1960s and 70s. So they come out with different views of the mental health system. But I think the history is important only because it keeps those values alive and those principles alive and constantly going back to them. It's like our roots.
Well, I'd like to respond also. And what was I just thinking? That the history is really important because, and that a lot of the peer specialist training programs don't even include it. And, you know, that it really should be one of the first modules that they experience. And I've found that that is not the case. I think that there's a lot of kind of models of things that are going on in different parts of the country that others should know about, and so that they can also create similar programs. And the arts, I think, are just moving really very well. And what we did with this art exhibit that we just created was phenomenal, and very, very talented artists. So I think people, they're not hesitant to tell their stories anymore. That's really, I think, very important. And they see their stories as being part of their trauma history. I think there's a lot of training about trauma being at the root of people's problems. And I remember I used to monitor, this was using my RN capacity in Fort Lauderdale, I believe. I was given the opportunity to be a nurse and to go around and monitor the psychiatric facilities. What I noticed a lot of times on all of the histories that were written, or the intake papers, there'd be some tiny little spot at the bottom that would say, had they experienced rape or abuse. But it was never followed up on. So that was the beginning of how much things were denied. I'll say one more thing, and I don't want to just, because I think seclusion and restraint, we did a lot of work. There were a team of us that went to different facilities, and it was funded by NASHPD, the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors. And so we did a lot. We had whole huge numbers of nurses and staff and administrators come to some of these trainings. And I think if we were to go back, I think a lot of times we're disappointed to find out that they're still using it. So that's what I have to say.
Oh, no.
We have gone over, but I so wanted to give you the opportunity to say more. We really have just a couple minutes before the next workshop start, but Sally and Bluebird, do you want to say any last thing to those of us who have admired you or just met you?
I think my biggest message now is the importance of advocacy.
Look, we have to pay you back.
Pardon me?
Go ahead, Sally.
My biggest message now is the importance and effectiveness of advocacy. Having been in, it's almost 45, 46 years, you sort of have a flyover view of the changes that have been made in 45 or almost 50 years. And I know that when you're all in the trenches, you don't see it. You're in the middle of the forest, you take 2 steps forward and it seems like you take 3 steps backwards. But in fact, you've taken much more steps forward. And we have to keep up the advocacy, and it has made a difference in our movement in over 45 years. It's changed the culture to a recovery, or at least supposedly a recovery culture. We still have to work on that. We have jobs. We're working in the fields that we have advocacy and passion about. Rights protections have changed immensely. When you see the big picture, the importance of advocacy is incredible. So to keep that up.
Bluebird, would you like to say any closing words?
Yes, I would. Yeah, I hope that I'm around to see the arts go further than what I've taken it. And I see the ability, I had the opportunity to write a curriculum for the Academy of Peer Services in New York. And I spent a lot of time on it, but now when I look at it, I'm thinking, I don't know whether people are getting the kinds of techniques or some of the ways that they could use the arts. So maybe that needs to be changed a little bit. And I think there's some people that are artists that do see this as a way of advocating for change. And I hope I have some part in that. I'm really good at networking people. I know where people are and I call them, and I'm probably known for that, which is, getting them involved. And so I can do that. But yeah, and I think that this position that's being created in New York, it's kind of really being developed there. I know the person that's doing it, and I'm very excited about that. I really am. What else can I say? I always wanted to have a vision for myself that I would be a traveling arts networker. I'm not sure if that'll happen, but anyway, maybe. Thank you.
I love that, Bluebird. We can travel now virtually.
I know. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. That's good. That's good.
It's been such an honor being with the two of you and the other 40 people who've joined this workshop today. Thank you so much for presenting it, alternatives. And this will be recorded and it will be available on the website probably within a half hour or so.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, Sally. Good to see you.